We're going to start. Assalamu alaikum everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Nayab Jan and I'm a social activist and a feminist organizer. And I'm very, very delighted to welcome you all to this book launch, The Reluctant Republic, Ethos and Mythos of Pakistan. So the gentleman sitting next to me here obviously needs no introduction, but I'm going to try my best. He's a man of many, many talents. And, he's a journalist, he's an author, he's a historian, he's a satirist. But I think most importantly, he's somebody who ruffles a lot of feathers. And that's something very important to have. And when you ruffle feathers, particularly in power corridors. So I think that's something that he has, something that he has to be proud of. His articles, his tweets, they really offend certain sections, particularly, like I said, whether it's the establishment, whether it's other power corridors. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Mr. Nadeem Farooq Paracha.
Thank you, Nayab.
So I think we'll start with, nation building and state building. It's a very, it's a fascinating topic, particularly for historians. I mean, how it's done, what is picked up, what is left out, how identities are created. But I want to start with the very basic sort of idea, and especially the title, which is very gripping. What led you to the conclusion that Pakistan is a reluctant republic?
Back in 2007 or 2008, I'm not sure, Khalid Ahmed, the intellectual, hosted a show on GeoTV. And the audience was largely university and college students. So after the show, or at the end of the show, he asked, how would you define yourself? As Muslim first or Pakistanis? And the results came out right there. 70%, or I think more than 70% of the audience said they would define themselves Muslims first and then Pakistanis. And interestingly, in 2010, I was working on a survey of youth for the British Council. Even there, we realized, or we found out, that a majority of Muslim Pakistanis were calling themselves Muslims first, and non-Muslim Pakistanis, largely Christians and Hindus, they were the ones calling themselves Pakistanis first. Now, that sort of got me thinking, and I've been thinking about this for over a decade, what is going on? Because, you see, if you're calling yourself Muslims first, there are Muslims in India as well, almost as many as there are in Pakistan. So why make a separate country? If you want to call yourself Muslims first, why make a separate country? Secondly, and I've traveled to a lot of Muslim majority countries as well. In Turkey, a Muslim Turkey citizen will never call himself a Muslim first. He'll always call himself Turk or Turkish. Egyptian will always call him or herself Egyptian. Even if you go to Saudi Arabia, they call themselves Saudis first. So there's a huge question mark. Are we not accepting that we are Pakistanis? Or maybe we cannot define what Pakistani really means. Even though the state has tried so much over the years, has tried all sorts of projects and experiments to define Pakistaniyat, but that is not sort of working. More and more Pakistanis, especially young Pakistanis, are calling themselves Muslims first. There's nothing wrong in that. But we live in a nation state. A Pakistani, which is a republic. Fine, it's an Islamic republic, but that doesn't mean you start calling yourselves Muslim first. You are a Pakistani first.
Right. So you said, we spoke about what the state does and doesn't do, and of course the state plays the most critical role in the creation of national identities. So I think my follow-up question would be, let's talk about how this happened. How did the state or whatever, the ruling elite manage to manufacture this reluctance? I mean, what are the tools that were used throughout?
Well, as I understand it, I think this is the result of a project which began after East Pakistan broke away and became Bangladesh in 1971. And I was going through a lot of literature which was written right after East Pakistan broke away by certain historians, especially I.H. Qureshi. He's a very nationalist, famous historian. And I came across two of his writings. One was a speech which he gave in Islamabad right after the 1971 East Pakistan debacle. That's how the state understands it. And he wrote, and then he spoke in his speech. He said the problem is, the reason why East Pakistan broke away was that Islam was not fully embedded in the national body of our country. Yeah. He said that was part of it, but should have been, that Islam should have been like the complete body. Ab wahan se, I think from there onwards, this narrative took hold, and there was of course a lot of insecurity and paranoia within the state, and that maybe now Sindh will break away, or the former NWFP will break away, and Balochistan will break away. And they very conveniently concluded this is because, not because of our own policies, the way we treated the Bengalis, but this is because we didn't ingrain Islam in the national body. You cannot find it in our textbooks, you cannot find it in our other nationalist narratives. So I think ye wahan se chala hai. And that is why eventually over the years, and then it peaked, as we saw during the Zia-ul-Haq dictatorship in the 1980s. And eventually, I'm not surprised now that a lot of Pakistanis call themselves Muslims first. And they don't know what being Pakistani really means. To them it means being Muslim. But then what about so many minorities over here, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
I mean,
sex within the Muslims.
yeah, and in the Pakistani state, I suppose the problem to a lot of problems is, you know, have more religion inculcated into people. Following from that, you've also spoken a lot about imagery and symbolism. You've spoken about how the symbolism of our founding father has evolved and changed. That's very interesting. I would really like you to touch upon that.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. If you notice how, I'll just take one little example here. The portrait of Mr. Jinnah. In the National Assembly, in state institutions and government institutions, when Zia took over in 1977, July, 3 years after that, or I think it was 1982, what that military dictatorship started doing was it started to replace Jinnah's portraits in which he was wearing a suit with portraits in which he was in a Jinnah cap and a sherwani. Yeah. As if that meant that they were, in a way, they were Islamizing him. So eventually what happened was, by the late 1980s, there was a huge difference between Quaid-e-Azam and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. They became two different characters, you know. And if you notice that Mr. Jinnah or Muhammad Ali Jinnah's name stopped appearing in textbooks, it was always Quaid-e-Azam, or maybe Quaid-e-Azam, Mr. Jinnah, as if they were two different people. And I remember there's a friend of mine who's a Shia. He was telling me when he was in school in 1985-86, somewhere in Jhang, and he said that the anti-Shia violence in Jhang was started to peak in those days. And he said one of his classmates, he was in class 8 at that time, one of his classmates got arrested because he was taking part in an anti-Shia riot. So the principal of the school, who was a Sunni, he was shocked because the arrested student was pretty good in his studies. So he went to bail him out But he asked that guy, I don't know what his name was. He said, "What were you up to?" He said, "Well, I was doing my duty as a Sunni because Shia are kafir." So the principal said, "But Qaid-e-Azam was Jinnah Saab was a Shia as well." So the student was shocked. He said, "Jinnah Saab was Shia, but Qaid-e-Azam was Sunni." Yeah, these are the little things which sort of got me thinking, what the hell is going on? You know, it's not only about we cannot define what being a Pakistani is, we cannot even define what Islam is. Of course, there's nothing homogeneous about Islam as well. But state started to define Islam as well, you know. And that's what we read in our textbooks as well. That's what we see in state-owned media as well. Whatever state tells us is Islam, and that Islam eventually became something which the people thought was better than what Pakistani means. You know, the state has a huge role to play in what young people are now saying. If you ask a person, "Are you Pakistani and Muslim?" they say Muslim first, because he or she has been told that, or had started to being told this in the 1980s. But I have a feeling that the state at this point in time, especially after the 2015 operation against the Taliban, I think there are some people in the state, they want to sort of take a back, just pull back and revalue or reevaluate exactly what they were up to. But I don't think they're succeeding.
Right. We've spoken about, obviously, education, I think, is one of the primary sort of ways in which the state puts its narrative out there, and the way that, and we're seeing that happen right now. I mean, you know, what's happening with the single national curriculum. So, you know, what about, you've also spoken about how East Pakistan particularly just vanished without a trace. So tell us a bit more about how education played a role in creating this identity, and why was East Pakistan left behind?
Yeah, you know, when Nazi Germany fell, they started in Germany, started something called Year Zero, where they start all over again.
Yeah.
So one of the things they did is it started to erase all mention and memory of Nazi Germany. 25 years later, in the 1960s, a new generation sort of emerged, and they asked, and they started seeing, and they began to understand and realize that maybe their parents, their teachers, the professors, they were all Nazis at one point in time. If not directly involved in the Nazi parties, but definitely they were sympathizers. And then another lid was kept on that. They just couldn't, they refused to talk about it. But after they got the pressure back from a new generation, they started to open up and accept this. There was something called Hitler or Nazism or fascism in Germany. In Pakistan, I realized this same thing happened. In Washington, D.C., I was there in 2018 as a research fellow, and I had access to some fantastic libraries over there, especially the Library of Congress, where I found a huge amount of literature in Urdu and English, newspapers, now certain defunct magazines, and also went through about 27 Urdu films. Now all this literature, Urdu films, were between 1972 and 1992. And I noticed that there was hardly any mention of East Pakistan. It was as if its memory had been systematically erased. Even your parents wouldn't talk about it so openly. Maybe out of embarrassment, maybe, I don't know. So I was at the News International, and I started my journalistic career from there in 1992 or 1993. There's some journalists over there started talking about the Hamoud and Rahman report, inquiry report, you know, which came out in 1972 and was suppressed. And a lot of young people over there in that newspaper had no clue. And their memory of East Pakistan was at best totally, absolutely vague. They didn't read about it in their textbooks. Their parents didn't talk about it, you know. And of course, after East Pakistan broke away, and this new narrative had started to come out, which said that, oh, East Pakistan was an unorganic part of the whole setup, and the real Pakistan was always the region which is on the left and right side of the Indus River, you know, which is nonsense, of course. But yeah, East Pakistan vanished from the or was erased, just as the Germans had tried to do with Nazism back in the day.
Right. So last two things, now I want to come to, you know, because on face value, when somebody says, you know, that a lot of people in Pakistan would rather identify as Muslim first and Pakistani later, one doesn't necessarily see the problem with it, you know, कि इसमें क्या मसला है अगर कोई identify करना चाहता है. So I really want to get to the crux of the issue, like how has this construction of identity, what consequences have we had in terms of democracy, in terms of how we associate with the rest of the world?
I think the biggest problem has been with this construction is that it's become very tough for us to reverse or even debate openly about certain very problematic legislation and laws in our penal code. You know, you can't even debate about it. Since we're calling ourselves Muslims first, that means that we are supposed to not talk about or actually support, let's say, for example, the Second Amendment or the blasphemy laws or at least the death sentence in it, you know. So it stops a lot of people. If you're calling yourself Muslim first, you know, a lot of young people get confused when they talk, say, okay, it shouldn't happen, we shouldn't have these bigoted laws. But then the question is asked, oh, but wasn't Pakistan made in the name of Islam? The truth is it wasn't, you know. A lot of historians have written about the real reasons behind Pakistan. Aisha Jalal is one, you know, and Hamza Alvi is there, and they say there were economic reasons for Pakistan to come into creation, you know, largely, and they were trying to escape so-called Hindu majoritarianism. You know, Islam was never such a central role. Maybe during the 1946 election, Islam did play some role in rural Punjab, where people, and it's very interesting, before we sort of get into the question answer session, I was reading somewhere that in 1946 elections when taking place, that the All India Muslim League was not all that strong in Muslim majority regions like Punjab and Bengal, especially in Punjab and rural Punjab. So services of certain ulama or All India Muslim League ulama was taken, and they realized that a lot of Muslims in rural Punjab hadn't even seen Jinnah. And Jinnah Saab was presented to them as a wise old Islamic ideologue with a white beard. You know, that is how they imagined Jinnah, as an Islamic ideologue who is going to go out there and create a caliphate or something like that. So you can find all sorts of roots of how Mr. Jinnah's image has been played around there, and what Islam meant in the total equation of the creation of Pakistan. So there's still a lot of confusion, and still a lot needs to be cleared.
Right. And also, does it also hinder the possibilities, or, you know, how we associate with people in our region, you know, as opposed to, you know, this ummah that we relate to more, you know, as opposed to our actual sort of South Asian roots, etc.?
Well, there is no ummah, we know that. We've seen it, you know. It's just a fantasy which I think was created largely or facilitated largely by a very decadent Ottoman caliphate back in the 19th century, you know, which was decaying, which was declining, and they found Indian Muslims who had suddenly realized that they are a minority after losing power in 1857, or complete power after 1857. They suddenly became aware of their minority status in India. And then they started looking around and said, okay, let's now talk about the Ummah and say we are part of the Ummah, which is far larger in number than the number of Indians, Muslim in India. There is no Ummah, you know. And if you go to a lot of Muslim majority countries, there's hardly any talk in the mainstream, at least, of Ummah. Of course, there's the OIC and all that stuff, but the manner in which we understand and treat Ummah as some sort of a spiritual, celestial, I don't know, cosmic creation or existence which is fighting a cosmic war of good and evil, that is not there anywhere. I couldn't even find it in Saudi Arabia, to tell you the truth. So there is no Ummah, and people who believe it's still a hangover of feeling of them being a minority in a region which is still dominated by a Hindu majority, basically.
Right, right. I think we have about 5 to 8 minutes, so if there are any questions, we'd like to open it up. I think.
Thank you for those provocations. If I could quickly point to two. One, you made this comparison between Nazi Germany and its aftermath. And the Germans have one of those wonderful compound nouns for what they then started doing in the 60s, which was called working through history. So how do you work through history? And the question to you and your news journalists in the 90s was, when you realized that Pakistan was, in the process of erasing rather than working through history.
Yes.
What did that generation of journalists and intellectuals do to try and work through, and or were they stopped by those sort of laws and legislation that you just outlined?
Oh, we tried to bring that report out, the inquiry out, as soon as possible, because I think that we saw that as a starting point to work through history, or to at least bring it out in the public so a new generation could understand exactly what happened and why it happened. We couldn't, but ironically, the report came out during a dictatorship in 2000, 2001, I'm not sure, during General Musharraf's dictatorship, where it was declassified, so to say, and yet, even in the declassified report, there are still a lot of segments and sections that are still not available in the public. They were blanked out. So we still have that problem, and I think the problem is that, as I was also talking about it yesterday, हम सब आज़ादी की बात करते हैं, फ्रीडम की बात करते हैं, चाहे वो इंडिपेंडेंस डे की हो, चाहे फ्रीडम ऑफ स्पीच हो, लेकिन हमें बेसिकली आई थिंक वी वांट टू फ्री आवरसेल्व्स फ्रॉम फ्रीडम. हमें आज़ादी से आज़ादी चाहिए, इसलिए वी वेरी स्कैर्ड कि व्हाट दिस आज़ादी और व्हाट दिस फ्रीडम ऑफ एक्सप्रेशन would bring out. There are so many demons, there are so many monsters that we've locked. Maybe they're not that dangerous. Then they keep coming out. Like, for example, when the report did come out, it didn't create such a huge sensation. Yes, there are large portions of it which are still classified, but it didn't create, like for example, Sindh didn't break away, Balochistan didn't break away, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa didn't break away. People didn't start to kill each other. So I think slowly and gradually things will come out. We'll have to come to terms with it. Come to terms with exactly reality, what happened in East Pakistan. A lot of people say, oh, why talk about East Pakistan after all these years? We have to talk about East Pakistan to understand what went wrong, so we don't keep repeating the same mistake, which unfortunately we are.
Assalamu alaikum. Over here, sir. In the second row. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Shafiq. Any thoughts on how can we correct this narrative? How can we go back to what Jinnah had planned for Pakistan when he says that riyasat और मज़हब दोनों अलग चीज़ें हैं? They shouldn't intermingle. So as a nation, how do we go to that point in time? How to go to that place? Because when you look at Islamic fundamentalism or radicalism जो कि increase हो रहा है society में, when you look at TLP, when you look at TTP, and there's no hope from the Islamic religious political parties as well. So how do we go to that point. And second question, sorry, is when you speak of Bangladesh, is it time that we tender an apology to them for what we did? Should we do that as a nation, or any thoughts on that? Thank you.
It's very hard. I'll start with the second question. I think we've always seen it's very hard for states or nation states to render apologies. We've seen this Turks, they still haven't apologized to the Armenians. In fact, the Turks say that the genocide never happened. We've seen the Japanese, they refuse to apologize to the Chinese for the atrocities they committed against the Chinese during the Second World War. And I don't think the Pakistanis or Pakistani state or establishment is still willing or ready to apologize. And it would be a big step. People would ask, oh, well, even if they apologize, what difference that make? I think it makes a difference. These sort of gestures make a difference. Secondly, I think it's also time we don't have to look back anymore to revive a certain narrative. I think that's almost impossible. You have to maybe evolve a narrative which is already there. And in my book, I simply suggest that, Pakistan should be about based on civic nationalism, which is just a lot of different kind of people belonging to different faiths, ethnic groups, are linked to an integrated economy. It is the economy which is holding the country together, and everybody benefits. The economy and the economy benefits them, and the country benefits. I think we have to move towards that sort of civic nationalism, which I think interestingly, if you go through the debates which happened before the final passing of the 1973 Constitution, I think the initial intent was civic nationalist. The Constitution did agree, yes, we are not a homogeneous or monolithic one people who all speak Urdu are all Muslims. It did, especially to the ethnic groups. It did recognize that Pakistanis are a multi-ethnic group. But then we saw within 1 year what happened to that constitution. It became distorted, and now it is a constitution which is जिसको कहते हैं illiberal democracy. It defends democracy, but we are an illiberal democracy. Forget about theocracies and forget about dictatorships. वो तो आती जाती रहती है. But we are an illiberal democracy, and that is what the constitution is protecting. So it's a complex issue. We have to revisit the constitution where we can make improvements, and evolve this narrative which is already there into meaning something, let's say, a bit more inclusive, because we become very exclusive. Even when your constitution ousts a whole community from a fold of a faith, what else do you expect would happen? Whatever you expect, you open up a Pandora's box. That's what we did. That's why what came out of that box is what is haunting and damaging this country. We become trapped, or we become victims of the monsters we created ourselves. So we have to look at this. It's very easy to talk about it, but we have to move on. But personally speaking, I've noticed that a lot of young people are now asking all the right questions. It's still a developing thing. The first thing is ask the right questions, ask informed questions, look for the answers, and keep pushing the state. Keep pushing the state. And that doesn't mean become anti-state or whatever, but you have to keep up, because they're the ones who say that we are running the country, and state is a gigantic thing. And so we have to evolve a new narrative, or evolve a narrative which is already going on. Call yourselves Muslims if you want to. Call yourself Islamic Republic if you want to. But you cannot impose one form of Islam or one form of statehood. You cannot. We are a very diverse nation. There are diversity within Muslims in this country. There are diversity within ethnic groups in this country. We have to understand that. We cannot politicize that diversity, but we have to accept it.
We have time for one more question.
Actually, you mentioned how Jinnah's image was manufactured in the 70s and 80s. Actually, it's much worse now. In the single national curriculum, in textbooks, after, first you can't say just Jinnah, of course. You have to say Qaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Then you have to add Rahmatullah Alayh. Otherwise, your textbook will be rejected by the Punjab Curriculum and Textbook Board. Even after Allama Iqbal, you have to add Rahmatullah Alayh.
I totally agree with you. That's what I meant, that he was, Jinnah became Qaid-e-Azam, and Qaid-e-Azam became this wise old Islamic ideologue. You know, you have to add certain things which sound very Arabic in front of his name. And that is how the lot of young people imagine him. You know, and I've seen young people who very surprised. Recently हुआ था, when they saw Mr. Jinnah playing pool with a cigar in his hand. And it was happening on Twitter, and these young kids were saying this is photoshopped by the rebel fascists. Yeah, because they had never seen that image in their textbooks. But now that social media is out, so most probably they'll understand through that photograph maybe that there was more to Jinnah than about just. And in the 80s, ne aapne baat ki, I also remember just before the 9 o'clock news, there was always certain sayings of Mr. Jinnah. And there was an advice to PTV that only use those quotes of his which had the word Islam in it. And 1984, if you all remember, 1983, the government announced that they found this secret diary of Mr. Jinnah, in which he had confessed that the Sharia is the best system in the world, and that is what. And then we also heard in 1987, the late Dr. Israr Ahmad claim that when Jinnah was on his deathbed, he confessed to his doctor that Pakistan should have been an Islamic state right from the beginning. You know? So these sort of things came out, and a lot. Us zamane mein, you know, counter or debunking wasn't as instant as it is now, because now we have the social media. A lot of people fell for that. Did you know that 2 years ago or 1.5 years ago, that video in which Dr. Israr is saying that, and which was absolute, and that claim was totally debunked by Jinnah's colleagues who were still surviving in the 1980s. Mr. Imran Khan ran that video on his Twitter account, on his official Twitter account. So what, ab samajh lein ki what else can you expect? Or what can you expect from the young people?
My name is Nawaz. And when some people in the world say that Pakistan is a failed state, some people in Pakistan start objecting to it. But if you consider what is happening in our country is, military mind and intelligence agencies decide who should be the MNA, who should be the minister, who should be the prime minister. If this is not failed state, then what else is?
If it was a failed state, we wouldn't have been sitting here. One can say we might have gone very close to being a failed state. We might be on a path, we've gone and touched to it. It's not a failed state. If you want to see a failed state, you can go and see Somalia, Rwanda, Yemen, you know, and reasons are different, external, internal. Those are failed states. Pakistan is not a failed state, and I don't think it's a failing state. It is a confused state. Yeah.
Okay, on that wonderful note, I think we'll close the session. Thank you so much. And I think if there's any takeaway from this, it's keep questioning, keep resisting, and there's a lot that's under the surface. So thank you so much, Paracha sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.